We'll wait for those who aren't. So let's get rolling here. Welcome and thank you for coming to this morning's seminar. Jesse Tack, for most of us, is not a stranger. He was just here a few months ago, I think it was in September, right, or so, and presented some very interesting work that he was doing at the time, and we liked him so much we invited him back. We are very pleased this morning to have Dr. Jesse Tack here visiting us today and into noon tomorrow as a candidate that we are encouraging to consider seriously here our program in the risk management position that we've been looking at and exploring to try to have Jesse come and be a part of our program in that arena. Jesse is currently an associate professor at Mississippi State, just recently anointed to that status. Survived, I guess, ran by that road sign in 2015. Started at Mississippi State, I think, '09, directly out of his PhD program out of Berkeley. He also has a master's from Berkeley and a BA, I guess it is, from Davis. So some background back in the West Coast and now residing down in Mississippi State. I think you've seen his resume. If you haven't, what I can synopsis it for you is it's a very productive, high caliber, high quality, high contribution research program that Jesse is leading. A lot of things around risk management, around weather and climatic impacts and the economics around those. Some of those around here in the room even have worked with Jesse, knowing better than I do in that capacity. But as well as some others around campus in other programs that work with Jesse. And multidisciplinary program because he is tackling issues that are quite complex and require multidisciplinary participation. He also has been a major professor to several graduate students who have completed, as well as a committee member on several graduate students there. Mississippi State has a lot of experience with students and has had good success there. He teaches several classes. I think probably the one that you've probably been most engrossed in over a long time would be your market organization class. I mean, that's a graduate class, and you can talk more about those, but has had really good experience as a teacher as well, and taught some other things at Mississippi State. Very pleased to have you here, Jesse. We look forward to engaging with you over the next day now. We're going through this very quickly, so I'll turn it over to you and let you spend some time on this topic, and we'll let you decide if you want us to interrupt while you're going, or whether you want to wait for questions at the end. We've got plenty of time.
Okay.
So if all 50 slides take 3 hours, we'll still be here. So, welcome to K-State.
Thank you, Ted. I really appreciate that introduction. Very nice. Very excited to be back. Thank you for having me. It's a little bit warmer this time, or colder this time. We were in the 90s, I think, last time, and a little bit colder today. So it's fun. Good to see variation. And I like temperature variation. So, I just made that up. I didn't know where I was going to go with that. I like temperature variation. I like seeing what it does to crops. I think that's a pretty interesting thing to study. It's complicated. You can do it for a lifetime. It's fun. I like doing it. So I had an opportunity to sit down with someone that does a lot of interdisciplinary work, and I was asking, they're real successful and smarter than I'll ever be. And I was asking them for advice and how to get more people to read your research. And they said, put your main finding as your title. And I said, that's kind of an interesting idea. I'd never thought to do that before. So that's what's going on here. I kind of like it. I'm trying it out. Maybe it's stupid. Maybe it needs to be a little bit more catchy or something. But it also makes it possible to do a one-slide presentation, right? I can read the title, tell you what we find, and then leave the room, and we'll all go on and do better things. I'll bore you with the details today, but at least there's some potential for a one-slide presentation, which would be pretty cool if someone could pull off some time. This work is with Keith Coble and Barry Barnett. I joked when I got hired at Mississippi State that I was hired as an assistant professor and I was doing a postdoc in crop insurance. These guys do a lot of crop insurance work. They're really smart. I've been really fortunate to have them as colleagues and enjoy a lot of conversations with them. This is just something that's kind of come out of many talks with those guys. Early on, I would say, oh, warming, it's going to affect crop insurance. It's, we need to study this sort of thing. And Keith's point, and I think it's a good one, was always like, well, in practice, the RMA is going to use loss cost historical data to update their rates, right? So they're always going to be kind of building any sort of warming impact into their premium rates just kind of naturally, because it would show up in the data itself. That data would feed into the new premium rate, and so there might be a lag, but he wasn't convinced that warming was going to have some impact on kind of rate setting. He didn't think that the rates were going to be grossly inaccurate because of warming. I said, well, crap, you just swept the legs out from under me. There's nothing interesting to study. And then I came across the subsidies, right? So crop insurance is a huge program. It's massive in terms of enrollment, and it's massive in terms of the subsidies that go out to producers. I think it's the #1 form in which we subsidize crop production. And to me, this is the interesting result. It's not surprising to me that warming is going to make agricultural production, as it's currently done, more risky. To me, that's kind of a natural connection. What I think is interesting is this relationship. So the other reason I like this title is we've got a path of causation here, right? So warming temperatures will induce higher premium rates. That's just saying that warming temperatures is going to make crop production more risky. That's kind of like a scientific connection, right? Like a marginal effect type thing. That's coming from the climate plant interaction. And then the next thing is pure like human, right? This is like a pure human connection. The pathway from the first two, I'll just, lack of a better term, call it like scientific. And then the pathway connecting it to government outlays is something that is completely determined by ag policy. All right? So what crop insurance subsidies do is they trigger as a percentage of the premium. Okay, so if your cost of obtaining insurance, the premium that you pay for your crop insurance goes up, there's a fixed subsidy factor, like 60%, and that's going to cause the government outlay of this program to go up along with that premium. All right, so it raises all sorts of interesting questions of whether or not the government should respond and potentially reduce subsidies if they're worried about their outlay getting too big for this program in the presence of warming. There's all sorts of kind of potential feedbacks going on here. But at least we can talk about the counterfactual of if we did nothing, what sort of effects would we expect to see? Okay. I don't know where the clicker is. And that's the most I could get out of the first slide.
Forward and backward.
Awesome. Thank you, Ted.
Beyond that,
The other buttons look very serious. I'll touch those. Okay. Okay, so the low-hanging fruit has been there, but I think it's quickly going away, if not gone. Estimating a relationship between warming temperatures and some crop yield. A lot of people have done this stuff. The economics profession in general has jumped on board, and they're looking at all sorts of warming effects on income per capita, labor, industry, all these kind of sectors outside of the agricultural sector. What I found was kind of interesting is there just wasn't very much done linking climate change or warming to crop insurance. And it's inherently a difficult thing to do. A lot of these things are interested in how will warming affect the mean outcome of something, like maybe a mean or an average crop yield or average things. When you talk about crop insurance, you need to understand how it's affecting risk. So you need to know things more than just the mean of that distribution, that average, and that can get really, really messy and complicated. And just in general, working with crop or yield distributions is challenging. Trying to get those things to move around as a result of something else is doubly hard. Okay, so the stuff I have come across, there was an RMA report that looked at warming effects on the FCIP, the Federal Crop Insurance Program. Nothing about premium rates. All right, so no one looked at how that rate was going to change with regard to warming. Another paper, DeFalco, I think this was in agricultural economics, not sure, I think that's right, studied farmer insurance demand under climate change, not talking about rates or subsidies. I think the interesting thing is the rates. They tell us how risky this production is, and I also think the subsidization is kind of a fascinating thing to think about as well, because it really brings in kind of a human policy element. Okay, so these are important knowledge gaps. There has been work on whether or not warming will affect yield volatility. All right, so will yields get more risky? That's been established in the literature. They find that warming does indeed make production more risky. No one's taken the next step of then looking what will happen to premium rates and the implications for the government outlays of the crop insurance program. So that's where we're sitting with regard to the literature. Some background on where premiums come from. Here's my favorite thing in the world, a yield distribution. Here it's perfectly known with certainty, normal distribution, a mean yield of 100. When we talk about crop insurance, there's always some guarantee, right? There's some threshold, some coverage level. Farmer decides what their guarantee is. They're essentially setting up their minimum yield, all right? So if they want a 90% coverage level, they have a minimum yield guarantee of 90. How do you start thinking about premiums? Well, it's just going to be the expected indemnity. All right, so we need to figure out what indemnities are. If you have a yield outcome of 150, there's not going to be any indemnity payment. If you have a yield outcome below the guarantee, there is going to be a payment. Here we're looking at an outcome of 50, in which case the guarantee is 90, and so you get an indemnity of 40. All right, so when we talk about premiums, we're talking about the expected indemnity. The expected indemnity is just the integration over these indemnities. All right, so for everything below the guarantee, you're integrating over those payments for each point, and you've got an associated density with each one, and then everything above the guarantee just gets an indemnity of 0, so you don't have to worry about that. What happens when you increase variation? All right, how should we think about premiums changing with regard to an increase in variation? This is just a mean preserving spread. I've just kind of inflated the standard deviation there. We still have our guarantee of 90. We've got two different distributions, the initial one, and then we've got kind of the fatter tail one, the one that's been smushed down, and we're increasing the variation. And we can see for our indemnity payment of 40, the probability of that payment has gone up. All right, there's a little bit of compensation that takes place up here, but usually the action out here is going to dominate any sort of reductions in probability of those low indemnity payments. All right, so what should we think about? Well, we should think about this as being representative of an increase in the expected indemnity. Premiums, or the cost of the insurance, is always just the expected indemnity in an actuarially fair setting. And so when we think about the increase in variation, we're thinking about a situation where the premiums are going to go up. Okay, so what happens when you couple this increase in variation with a mean decrease? All right, things get all sorts of messy, and all sorts of things can happen here. All right, the way that I like to think about this is I like to think about the risk implication. One way that you can think about the risk is just that coefficient of variation. It's kind of a normalization of the standard deviation that that makes these two distributions comparable to each other. All right, so if you have a reduction, if you have an increase in the standard deviation, this CV is getting bigger. And if you couple that with the reduction in the mean, this thing's getting pushed up even more. All right, so if under warming, we expect there to be a reduction in mean yield coupled with an increase in the standard deviation, those two things together could really push up the riskiness of this distribution. All right, so what sort of evidence in the literature is there? Well, we've got this previous paper, nice map, some Corn Belt counties. This is looking at, ignore mean, it's kind of misleading there. This is the percentage impact of climate on the coefficient of variation of crop yields. All the red stuff is the CV increasing. All right, so there's some evidence out there suggesting that production is going to become more risky, and we're just asking the question of whether or not that risk will be translated into higher premium rates and the implication for governmental outlays. Okay, kind of talked about this. Premiums go up, that's the cost of insurance. We expect that to be affected by warming. Important policy question. FCIP is massive right now. Keep this number tucked in the back of your mind, 6.5 billion. I think it's a 4 or 5 year average of annual subsidies paid out under the crop insurance program across all instruments, all contracts. We're going to essentially come to a level increase in the subsidy, and it's kind of interesting to compare it back to this number right here, right? So an additional, I'll try fancy with the math in my head, I'll screw it up. an additional $1 million would be a certain percentage change of the initial subsidy, or the current subsidy outlay. Okay, so we're going to focus on corn. What we do towards the end of this is we throw a really deep, hopefully spiral down the field as far as we possibly can, and we're going to take some implications for a very narrow set of crop insurance contracts and try and apply them to the whole book of business at the end of the day. And we're going to come up with hopefully some decent kind of intuition and evidence of why that might be the case. Okay? Okay, so county level corn data. This is from the Schenkler and Roberts paper that was published a while back. It's been updated to 2011. You've got a ton of county level corn yield observations. So very specifically, we're working with the county level corn yield observations. They're going all the way back to 1950. I'm currently getting an updated data set up to more recent years, but as of right now it's just up to 2011, which means you missed 2012, which sucks for anyone trying to do risk stuff. Don't know if that's going to change the results here, but that's a potential concern. What do we find? Well, under 1 degree warming, a decrease in mean yield is coupled with increasing yield risk. All right, so we would expect there to be some implications for premium rates. What do these premium rate increases look like? They are positive for the most part, but there's going to be some cross-sectional heterogeneity across counties. It's actually kind of cool to look at what's going to happen to the northern corn belt versus the southern corn belt. And in terms of the increase in the subsidy payments, if our long throw down the field connects, then we can say something along the lines of an additional $1.2 billion annually being a level increase in the government outlay. And if we consider a 2 degree warming scenario, that would jump up to 3.6. All right, things just maybe keep in the back of your mind whenever at least I have looked at impacts across warming scenarios, and the warming scenarios are like 0.5, 1, 1.52. There's almost always some kind of exponential increase. There's a lot of non-linearities going on here. And you'll kind of see that throughout this presentation. Look, we're doubling the warming impact, and we're more than doubling, essentially tripling the subsidy impact. And I forgot to say it up front, but please interrupt with any questions, concerns, comments, accusations. Crop insurance is highly political, but not in this room, of course. Overview of modeling approach. I kind of like this. I don't think this sort of approach to identifying yield distributions has been done before, but I'm not sure. People have done mixture distributions, but this is kind of a different stab at it. John Antle gave us the moments model in the mid-'80s. It's going to make use of that. For people that don't know a moments model, it's like a heteroscedasticity model. So you regress Y on stuff, and then you regress the residuals from that regression on stuff. All right, so that's going to give us a mean and variance regression model. Every single year in our data is a different draw from the weather distribution. So we can predict the mean and variance for every single weather draw that we see. So we're going to go ahead and do that. That's going to give us a handful of mean and variances. We're going to assume that that conditional distribution based on that weather draw is going to be log normal. All right, and I'll show you that it doesn't mean that the overall distribution is log normal, but the individual kind of underlying distributions are going to be assumed to be log normal. And then in order to get our unconditional distribution, we're essentially just kind of combining across the empirical distribution of the years. All right, each year is a weather draw, so we just kind of average those distributions together to get our unconditional distribution. Once you have a distribution in crop insurance, you know everything, right? So you can calculate the premium rate from that distribution, and then the subsidies are just going to be an implication of those premium rates. I'll show you how that whole mechanism works. And then when we want to simulate some warming effects, we're going to essentially go back to step 2. We're going to increase all the temperature outcomes in our data set by 0.5 degrees Celsius, 1 degree Celsius. We're going to get new predictions for the mean and variance, and then we're going to go through and build our unconditional distribution again. Okay, so here's the regression model. This is the moments model. We've got a mean equation, which is just a regression of yield on some county fixed effect. 3 different weather variables that are defined as in that Schenkler and Roberts paper. We get this piecewise linear function over temperature, so we allow for some non-linearities there. Essentially, temperature exposures above 29 degrees Celsius are going to really damage crop yields. And then in terms of the variance equation, we've got the residual from the first equation regressed on the same stuff. All right, so when we feed our climate data through this model, we're going to end up with a prediction for the county mean and variance under a certain climate scenario, or a certain weather outcome. Okay, this is what the moments model looks like. Essentially, the important thing here, you get a reduction in mean yield, statistically significant, and then we're also seeing an increase in the variance. The moments model doesn't tell you about riskiness as defined as the coefficient of variation explicitly, but if one wanted to do that, they would just take the estimates from these and take the square root of that variance and divide it by the mean. So this is telling us that variation around the mean yield is going up when there's a lot of high temperature exposure, but the implications for things like premium rates and subsidies, we need to go from this spot right here to a distribution, and then we're off and running. What does that distribution look like? Well, the mean and the variance is predicted for every single weather draw. So here I've got 5 different weather draws. Each one of those has a conditional, these are normal, but we use log normal distributions. All right, so we've got all these kind of individual conditional distributions, and then when we build our unconditional, we're just mixing these things together. And the cool thing about mixtures is you can take things that are normal, mix them together, and get things that are really non-normal. All right, there's really a lot of flexibility in this type of approach. And if you do yield modeling, especially crop insurance stuff, you know that distributional assumptions for crop yields will get your paper rejected if the reviewer doesn't like your assumption, right? Distributional assumptions in crop yields, I think, are something that we can't say a lot at the end of the day of what that distribution is, and I think there's still a lot of disagreement about what those distributions look like. This gives us a flexible way to capture a wide range of different distributions. In practice, these things don't look kind of cool like this, right? So in our model, they look kind of like a reverse log normal. I think Claassen and Just had a paper in the AJE a few years ago where they were talking about this reverse log normal. It's essentially a log normal with the skewness kind of flipped around. In practice, they look a lot like those. But in principle, we can have something super crazy and cool like this. All right, so in terms of the approach itself, this is really flexible. The other thing I'd say is, we didn't do it here, but if you had weather observations for 500 years and only had 50 years of yield observations, you could fit your regression model using those 50 years, and then you could forecast these individual densities for as many years as you have weather observations. So another kind of cool thing that's going on here is we can work with limited data sets if we have historical weather data to come up with as many of these conditional distributions as we have weather available to us. So that's not something we're doing here, but in principle we could go back 100 years and get that county level data and come up with the unconditional distributions. All right, so how's our premium rate defined? It's just that expected indemnity that I talked about before. The liability is just the biggest possible payment, right? So it's the maximum possible indemnity. When you look at the ratio of those two things, you have your premium rate. It's essentially a conditional expectation of the indemnity times the probability of an indemnity occurring. And then we've got our liability, which is defined by the producer through the coverage level, and it's always expressed as a percentage of mean yield. Here the coverage levels we're looking at is 0.5 up to 0.9. How do we get from premium rates to subsidies? Well, essentially, this is all unnecessary. What we need to know is that you can define the subsidy of crop insurance as a proportional function of the expected indemnity. This is the subsidy factor that's fixed by policy. It could change. We're holding it fixed at current levels. One could look at kind of how subsidy factors might have to increase in order to keep subsidy levels at the current level. There's all sorts of interesting things from a policy perspective you could do to play around with that subsidy factor with these results. But the key implication here is, given this proportional relationship, if you can identify the percentage change in indemnity, you can infer the percentage change in subsidy. All right, so that's how we're going to get to subsidy impacts in this paper. We're going to estimate the expected indemnities, which we can get from that distribution. We know the relationship with subsidies is proportional, and so if we can get our percentage changes here, we can get our percentage changes for the subsidies. And then the big football we throw downfield is we take current governmental outlays and we apply these percentage increases to those to get a level increase under warming scenarios. Okay, same data from Schenkler and Roberts, 645 counties. I included Corn Belt states, and I'm short-sighted, so I didn't put Kansas in there, 'cause I'm dumb. So my apologies about that, but we're essentially looking at a tightly defined version of the Corn Belt. We've got a lot of variation in the data. Corn yield variation, the vertical height of these things are the cross-sectional variation across counties. And then as we move left to right, we've got variation across years. So the cool thing about this data is you have a lot of variation cross-sectionally, tall bars, and then you also have a lot of kind of movements across time. The key variables for this study is that corn yield up top, and then this high temperature exposure. All right, as you produce warming impacts, it's really that high temperature exposure that grabs, and when you get more of that, that's where you see the big yield impacts. Okay, so we're going to focus on a very unpopular, narrowly defined crop insurance product that is based off of county yields. So any producer can purchase this contract, but they only get indemnity if the county yield for the whole county is below that yield guarantee. All right, so one problem with these sorts of programs is that they're not, the payments aren't triggered on the farm outcome, so there's a lot of what's called basis risk with these things. But among analysts, we really like to study these things mostly because there's more data available, although people don't put that in their papers. What they say is that there's the potential to mitigate adverse selection and moral hazard because the payment is being triggered by a yield that isn't mine. I can't really manipulate the payment.
Is that true in all cases?
For,
That last statement?
I
I
can't,
can't manipulate the county yield?
I mean, I'd have to either be a big,
Has it ever happened?
oh, I don't know. Cool, I would love to hear that story.
Okay, that's no problem. What's the other problem with the area yield? Because we've got the farm program based on the same area yield number.
In what sense?
ARC, the commodity title,
Uh-huh,
based on county yields.
okay.
Can you tell me how the county yields determined?
So, I would defer to
I'm just saying that's why you implied farmers are crazy for not accepting this. One of the reasons they don't accept it is because nobody can actually tell them where that county yield's coming from. And you can't duplicate it.
So my understanding of the current framework is that that county yield is coming off of NAS data, and that there's a movement towards using RMA data. The problem with using the RMA data is you're dealing with a selected subsample within the county. So there's an open question as to whether or not that is reflective of what the actual true unknown county yield is going to look like. But, you know, I confess to not knowing more about it, but my impression is that the NAS yield is what's driving the county yield estimate, or at least that's the historical data being used to construct it.
Well, they tell you that the data number is the total NAS bushels in the county divided by harvested acres plus failed acres.
Okay?
Failed acre number they pull from RMA, supposedly, which is not public. Then that tells you why you can have an FSA yield for payment purposes that's less than the NAS harvested yield. But how do you explain when it comes out higher than the NAS harvested yield?
Yeah. Yeah. Sampling variability, I'm not sure. That's interesting.
Sampling variability or judgment calls by
Right.
individuals inside that you can't match.
Yeah.
And then people like me are trying to explain why the government is not in a big conspiracy. But the numbers don't make sense.
That's interesting. Cool. I would really like to talk more about that.
Anyway,
And
I was-
definitely,
sorry.
no, and I like the, I've heard a few stories about the manipulation of contract outcomes, and they're always interesting and entertaining. It's like the closest we have to a really cool spy novel. So those stories are cool. Thank you. Okay, so how are we going to get at these warming impacts? Well, we've got essentially, I think it's 62 years of weather draws, which we can use to form a representation of historical climate, essentially average weather over time. And then we also have the simulation of a new temperature data set by increasing the daily min and maximum temperatures going through our construction of the variables. And that's going to be how we simulate these warming impacts, generate a new measure of historical climate, feed it through our model, get our new distribution, calculate our new rates, all that good stuff. Okay, another thing that people don't talk about a lot when they're doing crop insurance stuff, which I've always kind of thought was maybe a misrepresentation of the total uncertainty that's involved in the empirical framework. So typically when people work, a lot of times when people work with crop yields, they've got a whole bunch of crop yields that have been observed over time, right? So in this data set, I've got 62 observations on crop yields. Not all those yields can be thought of as being a draw from the same distribution, right? That distribution of yields has essentially been going up over time. Crop yields has increased. You can't just pool those two things together and estimate a density. All right, so what people do is they normalize the crop yields. They use some trending procedure so they can take all those lower crop yields from the 50s and normalize them up to what that outcome would have been if they would have been observed in current days. All right, that introduces all sorts of parameter uncertainty into the problem because you're essentially creating a new variable, right? And that new variable is based on the estimate of some trend function, and that's just a parameter estimate, and parameter estimates have uncertainty. Okay. So I'm not saying that's a bad approach. It makes a lot of sense, and if you know the model perfectly, it makes perfect sense. All I'm saying is when we get to the point where we're actually saying something about what happens when things change crop yields and they get some change in premium rates, we need to take into account that that data was generated by an uncertain process. Okay, so how do we get at correct statistical inference? I think there's a lot of ways to potentially do it. One that makes sense to me is we're just going to do a bootstrapping routine. We're going to draw from the original data, estimate our model, get to our unconditional density, estimate our premium rate. We're going to run through all those steps for each draw, and then we're going to pool all those draws together, and that's going to give us some variation in our premium rates that takes into account kind of that model fitting procedure, that moments model. Okay, so when we do bootstrap, we're going to draw whole years at a time. This is going to preserve the spatial correlation in the data, which is a pretty important consideration, given that there's a lot of correlation across counties in any one year. And that's going to give us some confidence intervals. What do the impact estimates look like? Well, there's going to be aggregate and regional warming impacts or effects on the mean coefficient of variation and the premium rates. I'm going to show you the results for the 90% coverage level. We've got 645 counties. Every single county gets an impact. All right, so 645 predicted changes in mean coefficient variation and premium rates. We're going to acreage weight those things to get kind of a summary statistic, a summary of overall what's happening to these states. And we're going to break out our states into the northern Corn Belt, Michigan, Minnesota, and Wisconsin, and then also look at Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana, our big three, Missouri, Nebraska, and Ohio. Okay, so what do these impacts look like? In practice, decrease in mean, increase in the coefficient of variation, and an increase in the premium rate. All right, so this is the summary of all those county impacts. When you aggregate those impacts by acreage weighting, this is what you get. All the action is in what I'm calling the southern Corn Belt. Essentially, if you were to look at these northern Corn Belt states, no effect on the mean, or at least nothing statistically significant, and extremely small relative to the estimate over here. Same thing for the coefficient of variation, and same thing for the premium rate. All right, so there's going to be winners and losers here. It's not like there's going to be an increase in the premium rate for everyone. It's just the ones that are getting hit have a lot of acreage relative to the ones that aren't getting hit. Nonlinearities, as you move left to right, you've got a warming impact on the premium rate for 5, 1, 1.5, and 2 degrees Celsius scenarios. As these things are going left to right, they're getting bigger. All right, so we're seeing an exponential increase in these warming effects. Okay, these are messy, but once you understand these graphs, I think they contain a lot of cool information. So let's look at the 0.5 degrees Celsius warming scenario. This density right here is just a density over all those 645 county impacts. Right, so 645 county impacts on the mean yield change produce this density. So looking at how wide it is kind of tells you that cross-sectional heterogeneity in these effects. What's cool is that as you increase the warming effects, these things start spreading out a lot. All right, so if two counties, if one was made worse off than another, that difference becomes exacerbated as you get more and more warming. Okay, Northern Corn Belt, just not a lot of action here. Southern Corn Belt, you're seeing the same pattern results as the Corn Belt. That's your big driver right there. Here's the spatial representation. So this is the percentage change in mean yield. This is 1 degree, that's 2 degree. Okay, so you just kind of see this thing shifting up. And you can definitely see that there's some bands. Latitude loosely is what's kind of delineating this cross-sectional heterogeneity. As we get more warming, we get exacerbated effects. Same thing with yield risk, that's going the other direction. Decrease in mean yield coupled with an increase in yield risk. Here we're using the coefficient of variation. The width of these things is going to be our cross-sectional heterogeneity. That's getting exacerbated as the warming gets warmer and warmer. Kind of tighter in the north relative to the south. Overall, for the full sample, the results are being driven by the southern Corn Belt. Okay, map here, again the same sort of thing. We're seeing the effects getting bigger, and there's a lot of cross-sectional heterogeneity. Okay, so what we care about, the premium rates, we've already got the densities, that's what we're using to estimate our mean and our variance. Might as well use them to calculate the effect on the premium rates. We're working with county level yield data, so it makes sense to talk of this in terms of an area yield protection program. We report percentage change in premium rates at the most popular coverage level. We're looking at 90% here. As you move to farm level products, that most popular coverage level changes, but for the area program, it's that 90%. Acreage weighted impact, same thing. We've got 645 impacts, acreage weight them to get a summary. 27% increase in the premium rate, driven mostly by the Northern Corn Belt state. As you jump up to a 2 degree warming scenario, we see a nonlinear increase in those rate changes. Positive on average, substantial impact heterogeneities. Again, we're seeing the width of these kernel densities kind of getting wider as we move across warming scenarios. All the action again is up in that down in that southern Corn Belt. Graphical picture. I just love doing this. Producer subsidy effects. We know the distribution that gives us an expected indemnity. Policy, the current setting of the subsidy factor dictates that when we have a percentage change in expected indemnity, we're going to have an equal percentage change in the subsidy. All right, so if we can get expected indemnities, we can get that percentage change in subsidy. We get that for every single coverage level. All right, and then we're going to apply it to current subsidy outlays by coverage level. All right, so what does that look like? Here we've got our subsidy outlay in $1 million. We've got our coverage levels going from 50 to 90. This is the policy we're interested in. AYP corn, there's no coverage level for this policy below 65. These are subsidy outlays, okay? So this is how much is currently being paid on average as an annual subsidy. The most popular, there's your 90% right there, and all the action is in the 90%, right? So purchases of AYP policies for corn that aren't at the 90% coverage level are few and far between relative to those purchases. Here's our total outlay. And what we do is we've got percentage change impacts in subsidy for every single coverage level. We've got some estimate from our data. We'd apply them all to here. We take those percentage changes, get the level increase for that coverage level, and then collapse those down and sum those things up. When we do that for a 1 degree warming scenario, we see an increase of $1.69 million. All right, and then when we get up to a 2% level, this thing gets pretty big. Okay, who cares? That's a tiny, tiny program. Cost of subsidizing AIP is small relative to the entire program. $6.5 billion annually. Any change coming from the AYP is going to be really small. Okay, so deep throw down the field. We're going to take our percentage change impacts and apply them to all corn policies and we're also going to apply them to the whole book of business for crop insurance. Okay. It's an estimate, it's back of the envelope. Here are some reasons why you think might think it's not too crazy, or at least maybe it's interesting and you could glean some information from this. First, what we're capturing is the systemic variation at the county level. All right, that's going to be a big piece of any farm level variation. Okay, so it's not like there would be an increase in county level variation, but no increase in farm level. Or at least I wouldn't expect that to be the case. All right, so we're making some inference to all corn policies. Well, there's going to be some systemic variation that we've identified at the farm level, and so maybe that's not such a reach. Okay, how about to all policies? Well, if you get corn right, you're getting most of the subsidy anyways. All right, so that's good. All right, corn has the highest insured value across crops, so if you get corn right, you're learning a lot of the story. But it's not everything. All right, our other major crops, soybeans, wheat, rice, and cotton, they're different than corn, but they're also sensitive to warming. All right, there's temperatures at which significant yield reductions will be generated for each of these crops. So here we're just talking about warming. We're using some effect on corn as kind of our benchmark, and it's not directly measuring the same thing, but we would at least expect these other crops to be influenced by warming as well. All right, so maybe it's not such a deep throw down the field. Other thing that people can look at in order to establish kind of credibility for this extrapolation, you can have historical loss cost ratios. All right, so loss cost ratios are reported at the county level. It's just going to be the ratio of indemnities over the premium. Every single year has some loss cost ratio. We can look at those outcomes at the county year level across these three programs and see how these things are moving together. All right, so we've got the loss costs of all crops. These are all in kind of bunches of threes. We've got all crops, that's the whole book of business, crop insurance, that's everything. Then we've got all corn policies, that's the next one. And then we've got the AYP corn. All right, so can we take the AYP corn effects and infer them to the other ones? Well, one thing that suggests that that isn't possibly such a terrible idea is that the average of these things are moving together over time. All right, so this is just some kind of trend specification down here, and we can see that these three lines are moving together. That's suggestive. We can also run some regressions. So here our dependent variable is loss cost for all corn. When we regress it on AYP corn, coefficient is 1. I about fell over when I saw that. All right, statistically significant, pretty reasonable R squared. These things are highly correlated with each other. Loss cost for all policies, 0.7.
Does that suggest that yield drives losses rather than price?
So this is the cool thing. So since the dependent variable is loss cost corn, the majority of corn contracts are going to be revenue contracts at the farm level. Okay, so there's a lot of variation in the loss cost of corn that is driven by price variation, or at least it's in there and it's important to take account of. That's why this R squared is not 1, okay, or at least not closer to 1. There is movement in loss cost corn around loss cost AYP that's driven by price variation. All right, so that's a really good point, and it's why you don't see such high R squared. You know, you don't see anything like 0.89, something like that. But I was surprised. I didn't think the R squared would be that high, and I certainly didn't think that $1 of loss cost for AYP corn.
594?
Huh?
You didn't think it was 0.594?
I thought this was going to be like 0.03. I was kind of surprised these things moved together so much. I mean, I'm going from just county level corn to all corn products. So, yeah.
I'm actually surprised it's not.
Well, cool. That's good. I was pessimistic. I should have been more optimistic. I'll be more optimistic in the future. Okay, so some evidence looking at loss cost ratios. Maybe this isn't such a crazy thing. If we continue on this fool's errand and do this extrapolation, now we're moving to all corn policies. Now we're starting to see some big subsidies. Okay, so we're just going to take those same percentage change subsidy impacts. We're going to apply them across coverage levels. You can see that the popularity, you know, is showing up not so much at 90, but here in the 70 to 80 range. Percentage change subsidies applied to each coverage level subsidy. Total outlay, $2.7 billion. What's our warming impact? $410 million. under warming, or 1 degree warming, and that jumps up to 1.1 billion under 2 degree warming. All right, the farthest you can throw the ball downfield would be to apply these to the whole book of business. If you did that, here's that 6.5 billion in subsidy outlay, warming impact here, 1.25, and then jumps up to 3.6 billion. All right, so you start getting some numbers that policymakers would pay attention to. I don't know if they'd see this and say, that's crap. They might look at this and say, oh, that's interesting, this is probably a concern. Maybe we need to change those subsidy factors as a result, right? Maybe they have some amount of money that they're willing to put into the crop insurance program to subsidize agriculture. Maybe this is the top number right here. So maybe when they see a number like this, they think that subsidy factor has to go down. I think there's currently a lot of political pressure for that subsidy factor to come down, and this might be something that kind of piggybacks on those initial efforts and becomes a moving force in that. Who knows? It's climate change stuff. So people either say that's all horseshit, or they say, oh, it's kind of interesting, it might be relevant. All right, so what did we learn? Warming will affect both the mean and variance of corn production. Yield risk as defined by the coefficient of variation will increase. This translates into increased premium rates. That tells us the cost of obtaining insurance from the producer's perspective. All right, so my cost of doing business as it's currently done from a producer's standpoint goes up if my premium rate goes up. Subsidies are set by policy as a percentage of premium. That means that the governmental support or the taxpayer outlay is going to increase as well. Obviously, a lot of caveats. This is a marginal effect of a counterfactual that will probably never occur. Okay? As climate change research starts becoming more credible, or people start considering it to be something that's going to affect their behavior, there's going to be some adaptation in an effort to mitigate those effects. All right, so what form will adaptation take? We've been fortunate to experience like a huge increase in yields because of new technology over the last 50 years. I don't know if that's sustainable. Even if it is, warming would dampen what those increases should be. All right, so just because technology outpaces warming, if that were to happen, doesn't mean that warming isn't having effect. It's just more of that unobservable opportunity cost type effect that's hard to put a number on. What sort of behavioral modifications? You're changing the cost of their crop insurance input. Okay, so modeling how that might affect their extensive margin decisions, intensive margin decisions. That's obviously an interesting avenue to think about. Will adaptation dampen increased yield risk? We've gotten potentially new varieties, switching to varieties that are more heat tolerant, that sort of thing. That could dampen the yield risk as well. So I think there's a lot of kind of future research that could be done. An argument that we've potentially underestimated these impacts is that we haven't looked at any price effects. Okay, so in reality, we're essentially just focusing on the yield risk component, and we're holding prices fixed. But under a climate change scenario, do we really think prices would remain fixed? Well, if we think that yields are going to go down in the major producing regions in the United States, there's going to be an inward supply shift. Anyone that's looked at the price flexibilities for corn will know that they're not trivial. This in turn implies that there's going to be some price response. As prices go up, premiums go up. As premiums go up, subsidies go up. All right, so this could be potentially a feedback mechanism that would suggest the results here are a little bit lower than what might actually happen. All right, so both sides of the coin. This stuff says that these things are bogus because they're too high. This thing says these things are bogus because they're too low. Maybe they'll net out perfectly in these estimates we spot on. Who knows? All right, that's all I got. Any questions, concerns, comments?
One of your assumptions here is that participation rates stay constant in your original study.
That's what I'm getting at kind of with these
Yeah,
behavioral
behavioral
modifications.
modifications.
It's not realistic to assume that's going to be the case, but in absence of any sort of kind of structural model taking us through the decision-making process, it's hard to say what sort of behavioral changes we'd see. I think that'd be a really interesting question to study though.
was just gonna ask, your $6.5 billion number that you kicked out several times,
Yeah.
is that before the SRA or after?
This would have been 2011 to 2014.
No, before the SRA.
Oh, right.
This all goes through a standard reinsurance arrangement.
Yeah.
So
So,
the results look very different.
I don't know. So I got these off the RMA's new report generator.
Yeah,
So what's your insight on that?
it's before the standard reinsurance.
Okay. And so what direction would it push these?
It would push your number down because the way those numbers are reported, they report the underwriting losses that accrue to the government side of the book, but they don't include the government's underwriting gains.
Okay. So the total
It
outlay,
overstates the amount of dollars that are actually being spent.
So
to
the-
public.
so the total outlay is potentially overstated, and since we're using percentage change impacts, the percentage change from the level increase is potentially
I wasn't going that far with it. I was just from the standpoint
the level
that
number.
the academics have tossed out these big numbers
Yeah,
as justification why you need to fund my research.
yeah.
You know, scare the crap out of people and they will give you money.
Yeah, I do the research for free. I'm kind of dumb. Maybe I could.
Well, you
probably-
need to figure out how you're gonna die. You're gonna starve to death if
Yeah.
you don't fix this, right? With global warming.
I just had a kid, now you make me feel like I could have had a lot more money. Go to a better college. More questions?
One of the things, the way you put in your heating, in terms of a couple issues there, you just basically shifted everything up by a constant.
Yeah.
Is that how they're actually suggesting that that's going to occur?
So
And how would that affect your results?
So there's been some interesting work. So a guy at Stanford, David Lubell, has done a lot of work on how the range of minimum and maximum temperatures has some influence on yields. And he goes through and looks at climate model outputs and has some stuff on how that might, because essentially I'm holding that range fixed as I move out into different scenarios. We did some wheat stuff, and for wheat, the warming scenarios, I'm hesitating to say anything. What I think I recall from what I've looked at from his research is that for wheat, in the major producing regions in the US, there wasn't predicted to be a very large change in that range, coupled with the fact that changes in that range didn't have a big influence on yield at the end of the day. So I'm much less sure of what the answer would be for corn, and I think that's a good point, and so it probably needs to be addressed going forward.
The other thing is, you haven't had any adaptation in terms of when they plant corn. In terms of, for example, they plant corn a lot quicker here in the south than they do in the north. And so if you knew, for example, that it was going to be 1 degree or 2 degrees warmer,
Yeah.
would we be planting corn in May
Yeah.
in Kansas, or would we be planting corn in March?
I think it's one of those adaptation questions, right? So do you switch your planting season? Do you switch the varieties that you're using? There's all
Does your
sorts
model take any of that
No.
into account?
No, nothing. It holds that fixed.
And then the other thing on price, where globally might you see corn that you don't have now, such that you could argue that overall, there's going to be a lot more supply of corn than now?
Yeah.
I'm thinking of the Russia Black Sea region,
Yeah.
in terms of if we were warmer there, I think you'd see a huge switch in terms of out of wheat
Yeah.
and into corn. And so you could actually make an argument that moving into those richer soils that right now are too cold
Yeah.
to grow those crops, you could actually end up seeing a lot more type things. And
I don't disagree. I just think as soon as you open the door for a conversation about how your model should be tweaked to account for adaptation, what adaptations do you account for? How do you model that? I think they're really interesting questions, and I think there's research going on in those areas. I'm probably not as up to speed on it as I could be, but it's not as simple as just saying they'll shift the.
no, I understand, but as an economist, presenting results where you have no adaptation,
Yeah.
is that any better than having adaptation in there?
I think as long as you're very clear about the limitations of what you're putting out there, it's a fair thing. We're talking about a counterfactual, and we're tightly defining it. I mean, I don't hesitate to put these numbers out there, but I think one needs to be very clear about the underlying assumptions, and I think you've raised important points that we can communicate that more effectively. Yeah.
I was thinking a lot about the, switching coverage level, and it might be hard to say how much they would, but you could, it seems like with your results, quantify the incentives for them switching coverage levels, right? Like, so you could go back and you could do some scenarios with your model, what would be, loss cost ratios at each coverage level, how would that change with climate change, what would be the variance in returns? So you could get something about how would their returns under each coverage level be different,
And I'm thinking,
current and future, how would variance and returns differ, and it might give some, and so then you gotta take another step to say, how does that
yeah,
translate? But at least you'd say, how big will the incentives be there to step up their
yeah.
coverage from 80% to
Do you think
85%
it's,
or something?
so I think that's an interesting question and worth pursuing. Do you think it's enough to know, so if you have a percentage change by coverage level, if you kind of relativize, how they invented a word there, those across different coverage levels, is that going to be the big driver of the decision making? I don't know.
So one of the things that's at least interesting for your model is that the subsidy rate differs by coverage level.
Right.
So that's going, as farmers switch that, it'll affect the
Yes.
amount of subsidies that are coming out.
Yes, that's a good point. Yeah.
So you've got to get what's the subsidy impact if they choose different coverage levels that increase subsidies,
Yeah.
then that's going to, because the premium's going to differ
Yeah.
at different levels, and then that subsidy rate is going to change.
Where that gets potentially hair pulling out is, where do you benchmark the utility level that determines how they shuffle?
Yeah, it's going to be really hard to say how do they switch it, but at least maybe you could quantify what's the incentives there for them
So some
to
sort
be
of
switching.
mean variance utility model, just pick a beta, use that to kind of guide your switching behavior. Sort of thing.
Well, because like they get, because these premiums are subsidized, they're getting more out of the crop insurance than they're paying into it, right? And then you could quantify that across different coverage levels, quantify that under different climate scenarios, and then also get what's the variance of their payments, of their indemnity payments under each coverage level. It seems like you could do those kind of scenarios, at least would
Yeah.
give some idea of how much. I don't know if it's in this paper, but it might be another
Yeah.
paper.
So we totally obscure the idea of there being, the way we set things up, we don't need to take into account the fact that there's different subsidy factors across coverage level, because we always stay inside of the coverage level. Start talking about adaptation, there could be some switching behavior across coverage levels that would have an impact.
That assumption is way too naive if you look at the aggregated data there, because people are moving to these other types of unit structures like enterprise units.
Right.
So even though it says 75% on a contract, they're getting a much higher subsidy level, or percentage-wise, than the people are. And part of the problem is what the RMA's been willing to release at this point, it's all aggregated data. So you really can't separate out what you're talking about. I know it's there, but how much? When you list, you were showing a lot of the coverages are at 75 and 80, which is true, but how much of that is at an enterprise unit level versus an optional unit level?
Jesse, you noted earlier that the data you have now stops in 2011, and you're waiting and anxious to get 12, because you're sensitive to what 12 may or may not do.
Yeah.
Within what you have you explored how sensitive your conclusions are to throwing out a couple of the extreme years, or throwing out a couple of the calm years,
Yeah.
the dates that you have now? How much does things blow up if you didn't have 1988 in there, or some other year that you do have currently?
This is kind of, so in general, I'm a big fan of robustness checks, but when you have a model that takes like 7 days to run, you're like, oh shit. I need to think clearly about which ones I'm gonna follow, and I think you're right. So one thing, I think robustness checks are great, and the ones you specified make perfect sense in terms of a set of ones that are reasonable for this study. That initial paper from Schlenker and Roberts did so much robustness checking and really found a stable relationship. I would be surprised if big changes in north-south samples and year samples had a big effect, but I think you're right to suggest that it's worth looking into.
So along the same lines, do you plan, say 6 months from now, you get that data? Take what you have right here and predict 2012, and then tell me how good it was.
Yeah, that'd be cool.
Because that's, you're halfway there already for that one, right?
No, that's a good point. I could use this as a totally, like, pre-registered almost experiment. And when I get that new data, that's a good idea. I wonder if I need to timestamp that pre-registration. And then I need to do it. That's cool. That's a neat idea. Thank you.
Just thinking about the adaptation issue, I agree putting in this model is kind of opening up Pandora's box, but I think it is important to think about the adaptation in relationship to whether these estimates are an upper or lower bound. Prior to Nathan's discussion of the variable subsidy rates, I was thinking, oh, this is definitely has to be an upper bound. And so at least on premium costs, right, this has to be an upper bound. I mean, if essentially you're not allowing anybody to adapt, this is going to be the kind of.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Am I not thinking about that correctly?
No, I mean, you would hope they wouldn't adapt and make themselves worse off. So I think that's fair.
So if it is, so any reason why it'd be a lower bound would be, I guess, kind of strategic decisions to capture higher subsidy rates. There's some strange interaction between being able to take advantage of the higher subsidy rates given the higher risk. So, I mean, which I think is actually an interesting avenue for kind of thinking about how policy might go in the face of increased premium cost, in this increased risk, because, you know, it's saying, oh, you should probably take a closer look at the subsidy factors and how they differ.
Yeah. A lot of conversation that I hear around crop insurance also has to do with whether or not these rates should be benchmarked across different seed varieties, different, possible things that you can get condition on. At some point, you worry that you're just getting the rates more and more wrong, or that getting the rates wrong creates a perverse incentive. I think there's a lot of interesting kind of behavioral implications and dynamics that could be explored.
You're more likely to insure or rate the insurance pool correctly than you are on an individual. You start getting that. Testing you can do, and I would question if you can really do that, because there's so much randomness around the weather event that's going to drive those losses.
And so I think it potentially puts the rates in the decision of dictating adaptation, in the sense that if there's a new heat-tolerant variety and they're waiting on 5 years of field trial data to get the rate right, what does that imply for decision-making on farm, and does it pervert adaptation? Does it lag it?
I think there's a big incentive to increase yields, period, regardless of insurance.
Yeah.
Everything I read that comes out of the university world is they forget the deductible that's in there. And people that are actually with real dollars on the line, they take a big hit before they get any money out of the insurance contract.
Thank you. Yeah.
Did you compare your predicted premium rates to what RMA has? I mean, you should be able to do, like with current weather, you should be able to do something like that. I mean, could you get a predicted premium rate, right? And then could you compare it to what?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember what. So I did, but not in a really detailed way, and I probably need to spend a little bit more time with that. So, yes, but probably not to the level that I should have. Thank you guys for your time. I appreciate it.